Today we're going to read from Merlin, The Lost Years by T A Barron. And we're going to start. It has a map. Every good fantasy book has a map. Prologue. If I close my eyes and breathe to the rolling rhythm of the sea, I can still remember that long-ago day. Harsh, cold, and lifeless it was, as empty of promise as my lungs were empty of air. Since that day I've seen many others, more than I have the strength left to count. Yet that day glows as bright as the Galator itself, as bright as the day I found my own name, or the day I first cradled a baby who bore the name Arthur. Perhaps I remember it so clearly because the pain, like a scar on my soul, will not disappear, or because it marked the ending of so much, or perhaps because it marked a beginning as well as an ending, the beginning of my lost years. A dark wave rose on the rolling sea, and from it lifted a hand. As the wave surged higher, reaching towards sky as smoky gray as itself, the hand reached higher as well. A bracelet of foam swirled around the wrist, while desperate fingers groped for something they could not find. It was the hand of someone small. It was the hand of someone weak, too weak to fight any longer. It was the hand of a boy. With a deep sucking sound, the wave began to crest, tilting steadily toward the shore. For an instant, it paused, hovering between ocean and land, between the brooding Atlantic and the perilous rock-bound coast of Wales, known in those days as Gwynedd. Then the sucking swelled into a crashing roar as the wave toppled over, hurling the boy's limp body onto the black rocks. His head smashed against a stone so violently that his skull would surely have split open, were it not for the thick mat of hair that covered it. He lay completely still, except when the whoosh of air from the next wave tousled his locks, black beneath the stains of blood. A shabby seagull, seeing his motionless form, hopped over the jumble of rocks for a closer look. Bending its beak toward the boy's face, it tried to pull a strand of sea kelp that was wrapped around his ear. The bird tugged and twisted, squawking angrily. At last the kelp broke free. Triumphantly, the bird jumped down to one of the boy's bare arms. Beneath the shreds of a brown tunic still clinging to him, he seemed small, even for a boy of 7 years. Yet something about his face, the shape of his brow perhaps, or the line round his eyes, seemed far older. At that instant, he coughed, vomited seawater, and coughed again. With a screech, the gull dropped the kelp and fluttered off to a stony perch. The boy remained motionless for a moment. All he could taste was sand, slime, and vomit. All he could feel was the painful throbbing of his head and the rocks jabbing into his shoulders. Then came another cough, another gush of seawater. A halting, labored breath, then a second breath, and a third. Slowly, his slender hand clenched into a fist. Waves surged and subsided, surged and subsided. For a long while, the small candle flame of life in him wavered at the edge of darkness. Beneath the throbbing, his mind seemed strangely empty, almost as if he had lost a piece of his very self, or as if a kind of wall had been erected, cutting him off from a portion of himself, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of fear. His breathing slowed. His fist relaxed. He gasped as if to cough again, but instead fell silent. Cautiously, the seagull edged closer. Then, from whatever quarter, a thin thread of energy began to move through his body. Something inside him was not yet ready to die. He stirred again, breathed again. The gull froze. He opened his eyes. Shivering with cold, he rolled to his side. Feeling the rough sand in his mouth, he tried to spit, but succeeded only in making himself gag from the rancid taste of kelp and brine. With effort, he raised an arm and wiped his mouth with the tatters of his tunic. Then he winced, feeling the raw lump on the back of his head, willing himself to sit up. He braced his elbow against a rock and pushed himself upright. He sat there, listening to the grinding and splashing sea. Beyond the ceaseless pulsing of the waves, beyond the pounding inside his head, he thought for an instant that he could hear something else. A voice, perhaps. A voice from some other time, some other place, though he could not remember where. With a sudden jolt, he realized that he could not remember anything. Where he had come from, his mother, his father, his name, his own name. Hard as he tried, he could not remember. His own name. Who am I? Hearing his cry, the gull squawked and took flight. Catching sight of his reflection in a pool of water, he paused to look. A strange face belonging to a boy he did not know peered back at him. His eyes, like his hair, were as black as coal, with scattered flecks of gold. His ears, which were almost triangular and pointed at the top, seemed oddly large for the rest of his face. Likewise, his brow rose high above his eyes. Yet his nose looked narrow and slight, more like a beak than a nose. Although altogether, his face did not seem to belong to itself. He mustered his strength and rose to his feet. Head swirling, he braced himself against a pinnacle of rock until the dizziness ceased. His eyes roamed over the desolate coastline. Rocks upon rocks lay scattered everywhere, making a harsh black barrier to the sea. The rocks parted in only one place, and then only grudgingly, around the roots of an ancient oak tree. Its gray bark peeling, the old oak faced the ocean with the stance of centuries. And there was a deep hollow in its trunk, gouged out by fire ages ago. Age warped its every branch, twisting some into knots, yet it continued to stand, roots anchored, immutable against storm and sea. Behind the oak stood a dark grove of younger trees, and behind them, high cliffs loomed even darker. Desperately, the boy searched the landscape for anything he might recognize, anything that might coax his memory to return. He recognized nothing. He turned, despite the stinging salt spray, to the open ocean. Waves rolled and toppled, one after another after another. Nothing but endless gray billows as far as he could see. He listened again for the mysterious voice, but heard only the distant call of a kittiwake perched on the cliffs. Had he come from somewhere out there, beyond the sea? Vigorously, he rubbed his bare arms to stop the shivers. Spying a loose clump of sea kelp on a rock, he picked it up. Once, he knew, this formless mass of green had danced with its own graceful rhythm, before being uprooted and cast adrift. Now it hung limp in his hand. He wondered why he himself had been uprooted, and from where. A low, moaning sound caught his ear. That voice again. It came from the rocks beyond the old oak tree. If you want to know what happens next, you're going to have to read this book yourself.